Hi, I'm Paul Marynissen. I'm Central Coast Council's Biosecurity Officer for Weeds. You might know me as Paul the Weeds Guy from ABC Radio and even being called Paul the Wacky Weeds Guy. You might have seen me around sometimes at markets. I go around and have a look at those. I also talk to local clubs and generally make a bit of a goose of myself. But I'm here to talk about weeds. I'm a horticulturalist. I've been a horticulturalist now for almost 30 years, specialising in weeds for the last 25 years. So I know a little bit about it and I've come across a few in my time. But what we're going to do today is talk about weeds. What is a weed? What is a priority weed? What do we do about them? With weeds, there's almost as many definitions of a weed as there are plants. There's a whole lot. You could say a weed is a plant out of place. You could say that a weed is a plant that's causing harm to somebody, an animal, or the land. Or you could also say that a weed is a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. I didn't invent that one, that was by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So, what makes a plant a weed? Well, lots of different things. A plant could be a weed to one person and a valuable food crop to another person. It could also be something that someone likes in their lawn, another person can't stand. So there's a whole lot of different ways that we talk about weeds and what we mean by weeds. But when we talk about priority weeds, many people probably would have used to have heard the term noxious weed. Well, we've had a bit of a change in legislation, so now we call them priority weeds. It basically means that those weeds are pretty much have been rated to be so bad that they've had to have actions ascribed to them. Some you can't sell, some you just can't grow. Some you actually have to tell us if you find them, and then we've got to get rid of them. So that's my job, and I have a colleague, and the two of us cover the whole of the Central Coast. So sometimes people say, oh, I've seen this weed here and that weed here. Bear in mind, there are two people and 1,681 square kilometres for us to cover. That is a really big area to cover. So we do try to get around as much as we can, but sometimes there are some areas that maybe don't get the attention they should, but eventually they will. So what do we talk about when we say that weeds are something that need to really be done with? Well, a really good example of just a couple of the ones I've got in front of me. These are both types of plants that are generally called prickly pears. This one here, as far as we know, this is about the only one we've actually got in our whole area. However, this plant falls apart really easy. When they stick in, they've got little hooks on the end. They barb in, and particularly on animals. And it's actually been found with wildlife that have had this stuck in them in other areas, and they've had to be put down because you can't get them all out. So this is a type of plant that if we were to find it, we would say to somebody, you need to immediately control this plant, get rid of it, you can't have it. There are other plants that may be a bit more widespread. So what we do to them is we say, well, you may have this plant, but you will have to stop it flowering and fruiting, you have to reduce it, you have to stop it spreading over your neighbour's fence. Then we find other ones that people have, and a lot of the time they come around by people giving other people plants. This is a really good example. This is a plant called Eve's Needle. Now, you can understand why they call it Eve's Needle when you look at these things. These are extremely hard. They'll go through gloves very nicely. We originally got this cutting from somebody that had a plant that was given to them, and the plant was only about that tall. By the way, all of these will also start new plants. The person put this in, and within a year, it went from this tall in a garden to over 4 metres tall. About 1,000 plants had come up from bits that had dropped off, and was actually taking over this person's garden. She had no idea what to do. She got a contractor in. We're talking over $3,000 to get rid of it, and the contractor said they wish they'd never done the job. So as a consequence, catching these things early, that's what we do. We catch things early, we go around and we try to get on top of it and say to people, this is why. We explain to people why they're weeds and why you need to get rid of them. There's very few plants that on their own will just go away. But unfortunately, weeds are not one of them. That's why they spread. So, the Biosecurity Act replaced the Noxious Weeds Act. Now, it's going to sound really boring, and hopefully you don't all drift off on me, but the Biosecurity Act pulled in 14 parts of legislation, all or part of, into one legislation, and weeds were drawn in with that as well. It basically means that under the old system, we had weeds and we would come around and say to the person, you've got this weed, you need to get rid of it, and that was sort of, the onus was on us. Under the new Act, every person in New South Wales has a shared responsibility for biosecurity. So if you've got a plant in your garden and it's starting to spread and starting to become a weed, you must take steps to deal with that. So sometimes with some weeds, they're listed. We say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you can't sell it or you can't give it away, you have to control it. And other times we might come around and say, this thing is starting to spread, you've really got to be careful with it. So you not have to get rid of it, but you can't give it away to somebody. This is pampas grass. This has, on this one seed head here alone, 100,000 seeds, of which about 99,900 will germinate. So it's a real big problem, wind blown, but people at the moment are going around collecting it and then selling it to people. You're not allowed to do that. If we catch you with that, we're going to warn you first, but with like a lot of things, if you don't take our warning, then we have to go all official. And that can involve fines, and they can be quite severe fines as well. So if you ever get a visit from myself or a gentleman named Stuart, and we're talking about weeds, don't worry, we're here to help. Thanks.